October 15th, 1823. The Royal Opera House blazed with light against the dark London evening, its grand facade a beacon drawing the city's finest into its gilded embrace. Clara Pemberton stood across the street, her worn blue cloak wrapped tight against the autumn chill, watching the parade of silk and jewels ascending the marble steps. She did not belong among them, these glittering creatures who moved through the world with such careless certainty. At 28, she had long since accepted her place in the shadows, invisible to those who measured worth by fortune and youth. But opera was different. For 3 years now she had saved and sacrificed, surrendering every spare shilling to purchase her seat in the uppermost gallery, where the air grew thin and the view required her father's old brass opera glasses. Tonight marked the opening of the new season, and her heart quickened with an anticipation she permitted herself nowhere else in her carefully circumscribed life. She crossed the street as the grand arrivals thinned, slipping through a side entrance where the gallery patrons were directed, climbing the narrow servants' stairs that wound upward and upward until her legs ached and her breath came short. The gallery was already filling with clerks and shopkeepers, governesses and students, all those who loved music but could not afford the privilege of comfort. Clara found her customary place in the third row on the left side, a position she had claimed through consistent attendance and settled onto the hard wooden bench. From here, if she leaned forward just slightly, she could see the stage, and more importantly, the boxes that lined the theatre in their tiered splendor. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised the opera glasses, adjusting the focus, sweeping across the boxes until she found the one she sought. Stage left, second tier. The private box of the Duke of Thornhill stood empty still, its crimson curtains pulled back, the gilt chairs waiting. Her breath caught as it always did, this moment of uncertainty before she knew whether he would attend. For 3 years she had watched Alexander Sinclair with a devotion that shamed her, studying his solitary figure, learning the subtle shifts of his expression, the way he attended to the music with an intensity that suggested he too found refuge in these moments of transcendent beauty. She knew he had been abroad for 2 years, engaged in some diplomatic service she understood only vaguely, and his absence had left her gallery vigil hollow and purposeless. But word had reached even her modest circles that the Duke had returned to London, and tonight she would know if he still sought the solace of opera. The theatre hummed with conversation and anticipation, the orchestra tuning their instruments in discordant preparation. Then movement in his box. Clara's heart seized as his tall figure entered, alone as always, his dark evening clothes impeccable, his expression distant and composed. He had returned. Alexander Sinclair stood for a moment surveying the theatre, and Clara lowered her opera glasses quickly, foolishly, as though he might somehow sense her observation from such distance. When she raised them again, he had taken his seat, and the familiar ache bloomed in her chest, that bittersweet mixture of longing and resignation. He would never know she existed. She was nothing, no one, a woman past hope watching a man beyond reach. But for these few hours, in the darkness, with Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito about to transport them both, she could pretend that the distance between the gallery and his box was not insurmountable, that somehow her silent devotion might bridge the vast chasm between their worlds. The first act unfolded with Mozart's sublime complexity, and Clara allowed herself to be carried away by the music, only occasionally raising the opera glasses to observe Alexander's profile as he too surrendered to the performance. She knew his habits so well now, the slight forward lean when a particular area moved him, the way his fingers would rest along the edge of the balcony rail during moments of musical intensity, the absolute stillness of his posture that spoke of complete absorption. She had memorized these details across countless evenings, building a portrait of him from stolen glances, and the knowledge of this secret intimacy filled her with equal measures of comfort and sorrow. When the intermission arrived and the theatre erupted in conversation, Clara lowered her glasses and sat back, allowing the gallery crowd to flow past her toward the corridor where refreshments were sold at prices she could not justify. She remained in her seat as she always did, conserving both funds and energy, content to rest and prepare herself for the second act. She was raising the glasses again, unable to resist one more glimpse of his box, when a hand touched her shoulder. Clara startled and turned to find Emily Fairfax standing beside her, dressed in a modest but well-made gown of deep green, her expression bright with curiosity. Emily and her husband occupied a box on the opposite side of the theatre, a privilege of his family's long-standing subscription, and Clara had not expected her friend to venture into the gallery's unfashionable heights. Emily gestured toward the corridor, and Clara reluctantly rose, following her friend into the cramped passage where gallery patrons pressed together in the warmth of too many bodies in too small a space. Emily leaned close, her voice low beneath the surrounding chatter. "I saw you," she said, her eyes sparkling with something between amusement and concern. "I have been watching you watch him all evening." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, mortification flooding through her. She opened her mouth to deny, to deflect, but Emily simply shook her head. "How long, Clara? How long have you been observing the Duke of Thornhill with such devoted attention?" The truth emerged in a whisper. 3 years. Emily's expression softened into sympathy. "Oh, my dear friend, does he even know you exist?" Clara shook her head, unable to meet Emily's eyes, shame and longing tangled together in her chest. "Of course not. How could he? I am nothing, no one. I simply find comfort in watching someone who loves the music as I do. It is foolish, I know." Across the theatre in his box, Alexander Sinclair stood during the intermission, but unusually, he did not retreat into the private salon behind the curtain, as was his custom. Instead, he remained at the balcony rail, and for reasons he could not entirely articulate, his gaze drifted upward toward the gallery's distant heights. He had been aware, vaguely, of a recurring presence there during the seasons before his departure abroad, some figure who appeared with remarkable consistency, but he had paid little attention, absorbed in his own isolation. Tonight, however, something nagged at his consciousness, a sense of being observed that prickled along his shoulders. He scanned the gallery's crowded rows, searching for he knew not what, until his eyes caught on a splash of blue among the darker coats and shawls. A woman's cloak, worn but distinctive, and even from such distance he perceived a quality of stillness about its wearer that struck him as familiar. The sensation was strange, unsettling, this awareness of another's attention focused upon him. October 22nd, 1823. Clara stood outside the Royal Opera House in the bitter cold, her thin cloak inadequate against the wind that cut through the London streets with merciless precision. She clutched the few coins in her gloved hand, counting them again, though she knew the sum already, knew it fell short by exactly 2 pence of the gallery admission price. She had attended 4 performances since opening night, each time telling herself it was the last extravagance she could permit, and each time finding herself drawn back with a compulsion that frightened her in its intensity. Tonight's opera was Don Giovanni, one of her particular favorites, and the thought of missing it created an ache beneath her ribs that felt disproportionate to sense or reason. Behind her, a young clerk exited the gallery entrance, and Clara found herself speaking before pride could silence her, asking in a voice that trembled with humiliation if he might spare a few coins for admission. The young man looked at her with pity and something uncomfortably close to contempt, before shaking his head and hurrying past, leaving Clara alone with her shame burning hot against the cold. She should return home. She should accept this as the sign it was, the universe's gentle insistence that she abandon this foolish ritual. But then another patron emerged, and this time Clara's whispered request met with success. An older woman pressing 3 pence into her hand with a knowing smile that suggested she too understood what it meant to love music beyond the bounds of practical wisdom. Inside, Clara climbed the endless stairs with gratitude and guilt tangled together, taking her customary seat just as the theatre lights dimmed. She raised her father's opera glasses with hands that shook from more than cold, sweeping across the boxes until she found him. Alexander Sinclair sat in his usual place, but tonight he was not alone. A gentleman occupied the chair beside him, sandy-haired and animated, leaning close to speak during the overture, in a manner that suggested long friendship and easy intimacy. Clara watched as Alexander responded to something his companion said, a slight smile crossing his features, the expression so rare and transforming that her breath caught. Then, unmistakably, deliberately, Alexander turned his gaze upward toward the gallery. Clara's heart seized. She lowered the opera glasses quickly, but not before she saw his eyes scanning the upper rows with clear purpose. Searching. Lord Philip Ashford followed his friend's gaze with undisguised curiosity, then turned back to Alexander with raised eyebrows and words Clara could not hear but could easily imagine. Some jest, some teasing observation about Alexander's unusual distraction. She watched as Alexander replied shortly, his attention still fixed on the gallery, and Philip laughed, settling back in his seat with the satisfied air of a man who had just discovered something interesting. The performance began, but Clara found herself unable to focus on the stage, acutely aware that she was no longer the sole observer in their silent exchange. Alexander was looking for her, and the knowledge filled her with terror and exhilaration in equal measure. The cold that had chilled her outside, now forgotten in the heat of this strange new awareness that perhaps, impossibly, her watching had not gone entirely unnoticed after all. October 29th, 1823, afternoon. Clara sat in the small drawing room of the house she shared with her mother, a room whose shabby gentility had once seemed merely comfortable, but now felt like a reproach, evidence of their slow decline from the modest prosperity her father had provided into something more precarious. The wallpaper, once fashionable, had faded to a pale ghost of its former pattern, and the furniture, though well-maintained, bore the marks of long use and careful economy. Margaret Pemberton sat across from her daughter, working at her embroidery with the steady patience that characterized all her actions, but Clara could feel her mother's concern radiating across the space between them like heat from the meager fire that was all they could justify lighting on this cold afternoon. The household account book lay open on the small table beside Clara, its columns of numbers telling a story she had been avoiding for weeks. And now her mother's gentle voice broke the silence with words Clara had been dreading. "We cannot continue as we have been, my dear. You know this as well as I do." Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded, unable to deny what the figures made so painfully clear. Their small inheritance, already diminished by her father's final illness 5 years prior, had dwindled to almost nothing, and the modest income from the few investments that remained barely covered their rent and necessities. Margaret set down her embroidery and looked at her daughter with eyes that held both love and worry. "Lady Westbrook has invited you again to her Thursday gatherings. I know you find them unpleasant, but she is well connected, and perhaps through her you might meet someone, make some advantageous connection." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, the suggestion that at 28, Clara's prospects for marriage were dim but not entirely extinguished, that perhaps some widower or older gentleman might overlook her lack of fortune and faded youth. Clara felt something twist painfully in her chest, shame and rebellion mixed together. She thought of the opera tickets she had purchased over the past 2 weeks, money that should have gone toward winter coal or her mother's medicine, funds she had quietly diverted to feed an obsession she could not defend or explain. How could she tell her mother that she had been spending their dwindling resources to sit in a gallery and watch a man who did not know she existed, that those stolen hours felt more vital to her than food or warmth? Margaret rose and crossed to her daughter, placing a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. Your father would want you to have some joy in life, not merely survival. But we must be practical now. The inheritance is nearly gone. Clara looked up at her mother and saw not accusation, but only tired concern, and the weight of her own selfishness pressed down upon her with suffocating force. She thought of Alexander Sinclair in his box, of the way his face transformed during the music, of the strange new awareness that had passed between them at the last performance, and she felt the dream slipping away like water through her fingers. I will attend Lady Westbrook's gathering, she said quietly, and watched relief soften her mother's expression even as something inside Clara's chest began to break. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. November 5th, 1823, evening. Clara climbed the gallery stairs with a heavy heart, knowing as she counted each worn step that this would be her last ascent for the foreseeable future, perhaps forever. The decision had been made over breakfast that morning, her mother's worried face across the table serving as both accusation and absolution, and Clara had agreed with quiet finality that she could no longer justify the expense of opera tickets when winter coal and her mother's medicine demanded the few coins she might spare. Tonight's performance of The Marriage of Figaro felt less like entertainment and more like farewell, a closing of a chapter she had never had the courage to truly open, but had lived within nonetheless through 3 years of silent observation. She took her customary seat in the 3rd row, left side, and raised her father's opera glasses with trembling hands, telling herself she would memorize every detail of Alexander Sinclair's face, store away this final glimpse to sustain her through whatever gray years stretched ahead. But tonight, something was different. Alexander sat in his box with a tension she had never witnessed before, his posture rigid rather than relaxed. And even from this distance, Clara could see that he was not watching the stage at all, but instead methodically scanning the gallery with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. She lowered the opera glasses quickly, sudden panic flooding through her veins, the irrational fear that he might somehow see her, identify her, find her wanting. Around her, the gallery patrons settled into their seats, oblivious to the drama unfolding in silence across the vast space of the opera house. But Clara felt exposed in a way she never had before, as though the privacy of her observation had been stripped away, leaving only vulnerability. The overture began, and still Alexander's attention remained fixed on the upper rows, his gaze sweeping methodically from section to section, and Clara realized with a jolt of pure terror mingled with exhilaration that he was searching, deliberately and purposefully searching, and she knew with inexplicable certainty that he was searching for her. The knowledge should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt only the crushing weight of reality, the awareness of the impossible distance between a duke and a spinster with a worn cloak and empty purse, the foolishness of her 3 years of watching crystallizing into shame. She should leave now, slip away before his search succeeded, preserve at least the dignity of her anonymity. But she could not move, held in her seat by some force stronger than sense. And then it happened. His eyes found her. Across the expanse of the opera house, through the dim lighting and the distance, Alexander Sinclair's gaze locked onto hers with an impact she felt physically, a connection that seemed to still the air in her lungs. For a long moment they remained suspended in that mutual recognition, and then Alexander rose from his seat with sudden decision, his movements drawing startled glances from nearby boxes, and Clara watched in disbelief as he turned toward the exit of his box, heading unmistakably in the direction that would lead him upward, toward the gallery, toward her. She stood abruptly, her opera glasses clattering against the seat, and without thought or plan she fled, her blue cloak streaming behind her as she pushed past protesting patrons toward the corridor, running from a possibility too terrifying to face and too precious to lose. November 6th, 1823, morning. Alexander Sinclair stood at the window of his study, watching the pale November sun struggle through London's coal smoke, and he felt more awake, more alive than he had in years. The sleepless night he had just endured leaving him energized rather than exhausted in a way that would have seemed impossible to explain to anyone who had not seen what he had seen the previous evening at the opera house. Philip Ashford sat in the leather chair behind him, watching his friend with an expression caught between amusement and concern, having been summoned at an unreasonably early hour to discuss what Philip clearly believed might be evidence of temporary madness. "You want to purchase every opera box for the remainder of the season," Philip said slowly, as though testing the words for sense. "Every single box. For an entire season. The cost alone would be," he paused, calculating, "astronomical, even for you." Alexander turned from the window, and Philip saw in his friend's face a determination he recognized from their years together in diplomatic service, the same focused intensity Alexander had brought to impossibly complex negotiations, but now directed toward a purpose Philip could not yet fathom. "She will have nowhere else to sit but the gallery," Alexander explained with a patience that suggested he had already worked through every logical objection during his sleepless night. "If I own all the boxes, she cannot hide among other patrons in the better seats. She must remain visible to me, and eventually she will understand that I am searching for her specifically." Philip leaned forward, his amusement fading into genuine curiosity. "You do not even know her name. You have never spoken to her. You caught a glimpse of her face for perhaps 30 seconds before she fled." "Alexander, this is madness. What if she is married? What if she is utterly unsuitable? What if your imagination has created something that does not exist?" Alexander moved to his desk where legal papers already lay prepared, his solicitor having worked through the night at his urgent request, and he knew that Philip's questions were reasonable, that any rational man would step back from this precipice. But he could not explain the absolute certainty that had seized him when their eyes had met across the vastness of the opera house. In 2 years of diplomatic service, he had learned to read faces, to understand the stories people carried in their expressions and gestures, and in that one suspended moment, he had seen in her face something that resonated with his own carefully hidden loneliness, a kindred recognition that transcended logic or sense. "She has been watching me for months, perhaps longer," he said quietly. "I have felt it without understanding what I was feeling. And last night, when I truly looked at her, when our eyes met, there was something there, Philip, something I cannot name, but also cannot ignore. The cost is irrelevant. The scandal is irrelevant. Even the possibility of disappointment is irrelevant, compared to the certainty that if I do not find her, if I let her disappear back into London's crowds, I will regret it for the rest of my life." Philip studied his friend for a long moment, then sighed and reached for the papers on the desk. "Then we had better make sure the contracts are properly drawn. When society hears of this, and they will hear of it, the gossip will be merciless." November 12th, 1823, 1 week later, and Clara sat in Lady Catherine Westbrook's drawing room, feeling as though every nerve in her body had been scraped raw, the discomfort of her position both literal and metaphorical, as she perched on the edge of a silk chair, far too fine for her worn day dress of faded brown muslin that seemed to advertise her poverty to the assembled ladies, who regarded her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. She had not wanted to come, had tried to refuse her mother's gentle insistence that declining Lady Westbrook's invitation yet again would constitute unforgivable rudeness. But now she understood that this gathering had been designed specifically as a form of refined torture, a reminder of exactly where she stood in society's careful hierarchy. The drawing room itself was a masterpiece of expensive taste, all cream silk wallpaper and gilt furniture, fresh hothouse roses perfuming air that felt thick with judgment, and Clara kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to prevent herself from fidgeting under the weight of so many assessing stares. Lady Westbrook presided over the gathering from a chair positioned to catch the best light, her silver hair arranged in elaborate curls, her dress of deep burgundy silk making Clara feel even more shabby by comparison, and there was something predatory in her smile as she turned her attention to the latest victim of her carefully orchestrated social cruelty. "My dear Miss Pemberton," Lady Westbrook said in a voice that carried clearly through the room, "you have been quite absent from society of late. We had begun to wonder if you had forgotten us entirely, though I suppose your entertainments lie elsewhere these days." The comment hung in the air, laden with implication, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, even as she struggled to understand what Lady Westbrook might mean, what she might know. Around the room, the other women leaned forward with the avid interest of spectators at a particularly dramatic performance, and Clara recognized several faces from various society functions she had been obliged to attend over the years, women who had never acknowledged her existence until this moment when they scented potential scandal. "Have you heard," Mrs. Harrington said with false casualness, "about the Duke of Thornhill's extraordinary behavior, surely the most bizarre thing to occur this season, perhaps this decade?" Clara's breath stopped in her chest. "He has purchased every opera box," Lady Westbrook announced with theatrical amazement. "Every single box for the remainder of the season. The expense must be astronomical, though I suppose to a man of his wealth such things are mere trifles. But the reason, that is what has all of London talking." The women erupted into excited chatter, theories and speculations flying around the room, and Clara sat frozen as she heard Alexander's name discussed with a mixture of fascination and disapproval, heard his actions analyzed and dissected by women who understood nothing of what they were witnessing. "They say he is searching for someone," Mrs. Harrington confided with delicious horror. "Some mystery woman he glimpsed in the gallery, can you imagine? The gallery of all places. What manner of woman frequents the cheapest seats?" Clara felt the words like physical blows even as her mind raced with impossible hope, and across the room she caught Emily Fairfax's eye, her friend's expression confirming what Clara had not dared to believe, that Alexander's audacious action had been for her, only for her, and the knowledge filled her with terror and wonder in equal measure. November 13th, 1823. The next afternoon, and Clara sat in Emily Fairfax's comfortable drawing room, surrounded by evidence of the security she herself would never possess. The cream wallpaper fresh and unstained, the furniture solid and well-maintained, the tea service complete without a single chipped cup, and she felt the contrast between their circumstances like a physical ache, even as she remained grateful for her friend's steadfast loyalty. Through years when most of society had forgotten Clara existed at all. Emily poured tea with hands that trembled slightly with excitement, her pretty face alight with romantic speculation, and Clara knew that her friend had already constructed an entire fairy tale from the fragments of gossip heard at Lady Westbrook's gathering, a story in which the Duke's extraordinary actions could have only one possible explanation. "You must tell me everything," Emily insisted as she pressed a cup into Clara's cold hands. "How long you have been attending the opera, why you never mentioned this passion, and most importantly, whether you believe the Duke's purchase could possibly be connected to your presence in the gallery." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks even as she struggled to form words adequate to explain what she barely understood herself. The 3 years of secret observation, the comfort she had taken in watching a man she could never approach, the way his solitary presence in his box had mirrored her own isolation in the gallery. "I noticed him the first time I attended," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "He was always alone, always focused entirely on the music rather than on being seen, and there was something in his face, a loneliness I recognized because I carry it myself." Emily leaned forward with an expression of tender understanding, and Clara felt the relief of finally sharing the burden of her impossible attachment to someone who would not judge or mock. "So, you watched him?" Emily said gently. "For 3 years you watched him, and now he has purchased every opera box in London, and you believe this is mere coincidence?" Clara shook her head helplessly, because when spoken aloud, the connection seemed both undeniable and utterly absurd. Why would a duke, a man of immense wealth and position, take notice of a spinster in the gallery? Why would he go to such extraordinary lengths for someone he had never met? But Emily's romantic heart had already accepted what Clara's fearful one could not quite believe, and she reached across to clasp Clara's hand with fierce determination. "You must attend the next performance," she insisted. "You must go back to your usual seat and discover whether his attention is truly fixed on you. And if it is, Clara, if it is, then you must allow yourself to hope." Clara thought of her dwindling resources, the money she had already spent on tickets when she should have been saving every penny, the impossibility of sustaining such an expense. But Emily anticipated her objection and pressed a small purse into her hands. "Consider it a loan, or better yet, a gift, because your father loved opera and would have wanted you to have this joy, and because I cannot bear to watch you deny yourself the possibility of happiness out of fear." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at her friend's generosity, even as terror seized her heart, because attending the next performance meant exposing herself to potential humiliation, meant discovering whether the Duke's actions were truly connected to her, or whether she had constructed a fantasy from coincidence and desperate longing. November 19th, 1823, evening, and Clara stood at the entrance to the Royal Opera House feeling as though she were walking toward her own execution, the weight of possibility and dread so overwhelming that her legs trembled beneath her modest gown as she clutched Emily's borrowed shawl around her shoulders and made her way through the familiar passages that led to the gallery stairs. The opera house thrummed with an energy she had never experienced before, a strange electricity that seemed to crackle through the air as patrons whispered and stared and craned their necks toward the boxes, and Clara realized with mounting horror that the public spectacle of Alexander's extraordinary purchase had drawn curiosity-seekers, who had come not for the music but to witness whatever drama might unfold. She climbed the narrow stairs to the gallery with a heart that pounded so violently she feared it might burst from her chest, and when she reached her usual section, she found it far more crowded than normal. People pressed together in eager anticipation, their faces alight with the same expression she had seen on Lady Westbrook's guests, the hunger for scandal and entertainment at another's expense. Clara made her way to her customary seat, third row from the front on the left side, the location she had occupied for 3 years, and as she settled onto the hard wooden bench, she pulled her worn blue cloak more tightly around herself, as though it might provide protection from the attention she could feel focusing upon her. The opera house lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the performance, and Clara finally allowed herself to look across the vast space toward the boxes, those elegant private sanctuaries that lined the walls in tiers of crimson and gold, and her breath caught painfully in her throat because they were empty, every single one of them empty, except for the box on the second-tier stage left where Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Thornhill, sat in solitary splendor like a king surveying his kingdom. Even from this distance she could see that he was not watching the stage, but scanning the gallery with focused intensity, his posture alert and purposeful, and the realization that he was searching, actively searching, sent a bolt of pure terror through her body. Their eyes met across the impossible distance, and Clara felt the connection like a physical force, felt the way his entire body stilled when he located her, the way his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen in a way she had never experienced. The orchestra began the overture to Così fan tutte, the familiar music washing over her, but Clara could not focus on the performance because Alexander had risen from his seat, his movement causing a ripple of excitement through the gallery around her, and she watched in frozen fascination as he exited his box with determined strides, clearly heading in her direction. Panic seized her throat because she was not ready for this confrontation, not ready to have her impossible fantasy tested against reality. And before conscious thought could intervene, her body made the decision for her, rising from her seat and moving toward the exit. Even as whispers erupted around her, and hands pointed and voices speculated about the unfolding drama that had nothing to do with the opera, and everything to do with a duke and a woman in a blue cloak. Clara fled down the narrow corridor that ran behind the gallery seats, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the terror that gripped her chest, the music from the opera house following her like a ghost as her worn boots stumbled on the uneven flooring, and her hands clutched the opera glasses so tightly that the brass edges bit into her palms. The corridor was dimly lit by gas lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of unreality that matched the impossibility of what was happening. A duke pursuing a nobody through the shabby passages of the opera house while society watched and whispered and waited to see what drama would unfold. She heard footsteps behind her, measured and determined, and her heart hammered so violently that she feared she might faint from the force of it. But she pressed onward because stopping meant confronting a moment she was not prepared to face, meant allowing her impossible fantasy to collide with reality and shatter into pieces that would leave her more alone than she had ever been. The footsteps grew closer, and then a voice, deep and cultured, and carrying an authority that made her freeze despite her desperate need to escape, spoke from behind her with quiet intensity. "Please stop. I only wish to speak with you." Clara stood trembling with her back to him, unable to turn, unable to flee, caught between panic and something that might have been hope if she had dared to name it, and she heard him move closer until she could sense his presence just behind her, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something else, something clean and masculine, that made her dizzy. She forced herself to turn and face him, and the reality of his proximity stole what remained of her breath because he was even more compelling at this distance, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes of such startling blue intensity that she felt pinned beneath their focus like a butterfly under glass. His face held no disappointment or confusion, only a focused curiosity, and something else she could not identify, something that looked almost like relief. And when he spoke again, his voice was gentler than she had imagined in all her years of watching from afar. "I have been searching for you," he said simply, and the words hung in the air between them like a confession. Clara felt her hands shake so badly that the opera glasses rattled, and she clutched them to her chest like a shield as she struggled to find words adequate to respond to a statement that made no sense, that defied everything she understood about her place in the world and his position so far above her. "You have made a mistake," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the muffled strains of music that filtered through the walls. "I am no one. Nothing that should concern a man of your position." His expression shifted slightly, something that might have been amusement or tenderness or perhaps both crossing his features. And he took another step closer until the space between them had narrowed to something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. "I will not presume to know your reasons," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her in the cold corridor, and Clara felt something inside her chest twist painfully because his tone held no condescension or mockery, only a genuine interest that terrified her more than contempt ever could. "Will you tell me your name?" The question was simple, direct, yet it felt impossibly intimate, as though in speaking her name she would be surrendering something precious and unprotected to the judgment of a man who existed in a world so far removed from her own that they might as well have been on different continents. She shook her head, unable to form words, and saw something flicker in his expression, not disappointment, but rather a patient determination that suggested he was accustomed to navigating difficult negotiations. "Then will you at least tell me why you come to the gallery? Why you sit in the same seat at every performance? Why you watch the stage with such complete absorption that the rest of the world seems to disappear?" Clara's breath caught because his questions revealed the depth of his observation, proved that he had not merely noticed her presence, but had studied her habits with the same intensity she had devoted to watching him, and the realization sent a wave of shame and wonder through her in equal measure. "I come for the music," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muffled sounds of the second act beginning beyond the walls. "That is all. That is the only reason anyone should need." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something gentler, and he took another small step forward until she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of evening beard along his jaw, details she had never been able to discern from her distant vantage point in the gallery. "I have watched you for months," he said, and the confession sent shock through her system like lightning. "I have watched the way you lean forward during the arias, the way your hands move slightly as though conducting, the way you close your eyes during the most beautiful passages as though you are trying to absorb the music into your very soul. You are not like the others who come here, the ones who attend to be seen rather than to see, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about what kind of woman loves opera with such devotion that she climbs to the highest seats week after week, regardless of weather or circumstance." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, because his words described her more accurately than she had ever described herself, saw into the very heart of what the opera meant to her, and the fact that he had noticed, that he had cared enough to notice, was almost more than she could bear. "You do not know me," she managed to say, her voice breaking slightly. "You cannot possibly understand who I am or what limitations govern my life." His expression shifted, becoming more serious, more intent, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute conviction that allowed no room for doubt. Clara sat in the morning room where pale November sunlight streamed through windows that needed washing, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, while her untouched breakfast grew cold on the plate before her, and her mother watched with increasing concern from across the small table where the teapot sat between them like a silent witness to her daughter's distraction. Sleep had been impossible after she had returned home the previous evening, her mind replaying every word Alexander had spoken in that dim corridor, every nuance of his expression, the intensity in his blue eyes that had seemed to see straight through all her careful defenses to something she herself had not known existed within her. And now, in the honest light of morning, she could not decide whether what had transpired was the beginning of something miraculous or merely a prelude to devastating disappointment. The opera glasses lay on the table beside her plate, the brass catching the sunlight and throwing small reflections on the wall, and she found herself staring at them as though they held answers to questions she could not quite formulate. These instruments that had allowed her to observe him from safe distance for 3 years now seeming almost like accomplices to some crime she had committed without fully understanding its nature. Margaret set down her cup with a gentle click that drew Clara's attention, and her mother's face held that expression of patient concern that had become increasingly frequent over the past weeks. The look of a woman who sensed her daughter was keeping secrets, but who loved her too much to demand confession without invitation. "You did not sleep," Margaret said quietly, and it was not quite a question, but rather an observation offered with the hope that it might open a door to confidence. Clara felt her throat tighten because the truth was far too complicated and too fragile to speak aloud, too precious and too terrifying to expose to the practical light of day. And yet the burden of carrying it alone was becoming unbearable in a way that made her chest ache with the weight of unexpressed emotion. "I went to the opera last night," she heard herself say, the words emerging before she had decided to speak them, and she watched her mother's expression shift from concern to confusion because they both knew the financial constraints that had supposedly ended Clara's opera attendance weeks ago. Margaret's hands stilled on her cup, and her eyes searched her daughter's face with an intensity that reminded Clara of how perceptive her mother truly was beneath her gentle exterior, how little actually escaped her notice, despite Clara's best efforts at concealment. "I have been going regularly," Clara continued, her voice barely above a whisper, the confession tumbling out now that she had begun. "I have been using money from my small inheritance, the one father left specifically to me, and I know it was selfish and impractical, but the opera was the only thing that made life bearable, the only place where I could forget for a few hours that I am a burden and a disappointment, and a woman whose best years have passed without notice." Margaret's expression softened into something that looked like both sadness and understanding. But before she could speak, Clara rushed onward, because if she stopped now, she would never find courage to continue. "And last night, something happened that I cannot explain or understand, something that seems impossible in the light of morning, but that felt terrifyingly real in the moment." The week that followed Clara's confession to her, Mother passed in a strange suspension of time, where each day felt simultaneously endless and rushed, filled with a restless anticipation that made ordinary tasks impossible to complete, while hours somehow vanished without accounting. And when November 26th arrived, Clara found herself standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, wearing her best gown, which was still modest by any measure, a simple design in deep burgundy that Emily had helped her alter years ago, and that now felt simultaneously too plain for the occasion, and yet more elegant than anything she had worn to the opera before, the borrowed shawl from Emily draped over her shoulders in soft cream wool that added a touch of refinement she could never have afforded herself. The opera house seemed more crowded than usual when she arrived, the gallery packed with curious spectators who had clearly come as much to witness the ongoing spectacle of the Duke's mysterious search as to hear La Traviata, and Clara felt their eyes upon her as she made her way to her customary seat in the third row on the left side, felt the weight of observation that had once belonged only to her now reversed and multiplied, transforming her from invisible watcher to unwilling performer in a drama she had never intended to create. She had attended every performance that week as she had promised Alexander in that dim corridor, had felt his gaze upon her each evening from his solitary box, had met his eyes across the vast space of the theatre with a mixture of terror and wonder that made her heart race and her hands tremble on the brass opera glasses that had become both talisman and witness to this impossible transformation of her circumstances. The first act proceeded as usual, though Clara found it difficult to focus on the music that normally consumed her complete attention, her awareness fragmented between the stage and the box where Alexander sat with that same patient intensity she had observed in him for 3 years, and when intermission came she remained in her seat while others rose and stretched and gossiped around her, uncertain whether she should move or stay, whether he would approach or merely watch as he had done all week. She saw him rise from his box with deliberate purpose, saw him exit into the corridor, and her breath caught because surely he would not come to the gallery, would not make so public a gesture in a space crowded with witnesses whose tongues would carry every detail of this encounter throughout London society before morning arrived. The crowd around her seemed to sense something imminent, their chatter subsiding into expectant whispers as the Duke of Thornhill appeared at the gallery entrance, his tall figure elegant in evening dress that spoke of wealth and position so far above her own station that the distance should have been unbridgeable, and yet he moved through the crowd with single-minded focus that allowed no obstacle until he stood before her seat where she sat frozen with the opera glasses clutched in her hands like a shield against impossibility. "Miss Pemberton," he said quietly, and the use of her name which she had finally given him during their last brief exchange sent a shock through her system because hearing it spoken in his voice made everything suddenly and terrifyingly real. "May I have the honor of your company during intermission?" And it was phrased as a question, but his extended hand and the intensity of his gaze suggested he would accept no refusal. Not now, not with all of London watching. Clara found herself handed into Alexander's carriage with a care that suggested she was something precious rather than the unremarkable spinster she had always believed herself to be, and as the door closed behind them, creating an intimate space lit only by the swaying carriage lamps, she became acutely aware of the impropriety of this situation, an unmarried woman alone with a man in the confined darkness, while London streets rolled past outside, yet the thrill of transgression was overwhelmed by a deeper terror that this conversation would somehow shatter the fragile magic of the past weeks and return her to the grey reality of her previous existence. Alexander settled across from her rather than beside her, a consideration for propriety that she found both reassuring and disappointing, and in the flickering light his face held an expression of quiet contentment that made him seem less the remote duke she had observed through opera glasses, and more a man of flesh and genuine feeling. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Pemberton," he said quietly as the carriage lurched into motion, and the simple request felt impossibly vast, because how could she possibly explain the small, circumscribed life she had led, the slow constriction of possibilities that had marked her progress from hopeful girl to resigned woman? She found herself speaking haltingly at first about her father, who had been a gentleman of modest means with an passionate love for opera, who had taken her to performances from the time she was 8 years old and taught her to hear the mathematical precision beneath the soaring emotion, who had died 5 years ago, leaving them with just enough to maintain appearances, but not enough to truly sustain their former position in even the modest circles they had once inhabited. Alexander listened with an intensity that made her feel as though every word mattered, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness, and gradually she found herself speaking more freely about the music itself, about her observations of different singers' techniques and her theories, about why certain performances moved audiences while others left them cold. "I noticed you," he said after she had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes without pause, because you watched the stage with such complete absorption that it was clear you were actually hearing something the rest of us missed, and I found myself watching you to understand what you were experiencing, because my own attendance at the opera had become merely habitual rather than meaningful. The admission surprised her, because she had assumed his attention had been captured by something about her appearance or manner rather than by the quality of her listening, and she looked at him with new curiosity as the carriage turned into her neighborhood, where the houses grew shabbier and the street lamps fewer. "You attended alone?" he continued, "always in the same seat, always arriving just as the lamps dimmed and leaving during the final applause, and there was something in that solitary devotion that I recognized because I too have spent years being alone in crowded rooms, fulfilling obligations while feeling utterly disconnected from the performance of social life happening around me." The carriage slowed before her building, which looked even more humble than usual when contrasted with the fine equipage that now stood before it, and Clara felt shame rise hot in her throat because surely now he would see the full extent of the distance between them and recognize the impossibility of whatever connection he imagined they might forge. But Alexander merely glanced at the building with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout their conversation, and then returned his gaze to her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "May I call on you formally, Miss Pemberton?" he asked, and it was a question that carried weight far beyond its simple words, because they both understood he was asking permission to begin something that society would view with scandal and suspicion, and Clara found herself nodding before wisdom or caution could intervene, because the alternative of returning to invisible obscurity felt suddenly unbearable now that she had glimpsed another possibility. The week following that carriage ride passed in a strange, dream-like suspension, where Clara found herself existing in two worlds simultaneously. The familiar grey reality of her modest home and constrained circumstances running parallel to an impossible alternate existence, where a duke had requested permission to call upon her formally, and on December the 3rd, when the appointed afternoon arrived, she discovered herself in a state of anxious preparation that her mother observed with a mixture of concern and cautious hope that had characterized Margaret's demeanor since Clara had finally confessed the entire improbable sequence of events that had unfolded over the past weeks. Their small drawing room had been cleaned with unusual care, the modest furniture arranged to best advantage, though no amount of arrangement could disguise the worn upholstery or the faded curtains that spoke eloquently of their declining fortunes, and Clara had set out their tea service with hands that trembled slightly, because she understood this visit represented Alexander's first true glimpse into the material reality of her circumstances, rather than the romantic obscurity of darkened theatres and nighttime carriage rides. The rain that had begun that morning continued in a steady drum against the windows, turning the afternoon prematurely grey, and making their small fire necessary for both warmth and light. And when the knock finally came at precisely 3 o'clock, Clara felt her heart accelerate with such force she thought surely her mother must hear it across the room. Alexander entered their humble space with an ease that suggested he found nothing awkward in the contrast between his obvious wealth and their genteel poverty, his tall frame somehow fitting naturally into their small drawing-room as he bowed to Margaret with a respect that immediately softened her protective maternal wariness. And Clara watched her mother assess him with the shrewd attention of a woman whose life had taught her to judge character beneath surface presentations. The conversation that followed revealed Alexander's particular gift for genuine interest in others. His questions about Margaret's history and Clara's childhood, drawing out stories that made their small life seem worthy of attention rather than apologetic explanation. And Clara observed with growing wonder as her mother gradually relaxed into animated discussion of her late husband's passion for opera and music, gesturing toward the shelves where his collection of opera books and scores still resided in places of honor, despite their reduced circumstances. Alexander rose to examine the volumes with an attention that could not be feigned, pulling down a particularly worn copy of a libretto for Don Giovanni, and noting with pleasure the extensive annotations in her father's hand that analyzed musical passages and dramatic structures, and the fact that he recognized the intelligence and scholarship in those marginalia seemed to touch Margaret in a way that formal courtesies could not have achieved. When Alexander invited Clara to attend the opera with him the following week from his private box, rather than the gallery where they had first established their peculiar connection, it was Margaret who answered that Clara would be honored to accept before her daughter could formulate a response, and something in her mother's decisive intervention suggested she had made her own assessment of this unlikely suitor and found him worthy of trust despite the vast social distance that separated their positions. As Alexander prepared to depart after the socially appropriate duration for a formal call, he paused at the doorway and mentioned with studied casualness that he had taken the liberty of establishing a credit for their family at the Opera House box office, a gesture he hoped they would not find presumptuous, but which would allow them both to attend performances whenever they wished, regardless of his own schedule. And before Clara could protest this extraordinary generosity, Margaret accepted with a dignity that suggested she understood the gift was offered not as charity but as recognition of their shared devotion to the art form that had brought them all together. The evening of December 10th arrived with a cold clarity that made the gas lamps of the opera house blaze with particular brilliance, and Clara found herself ascending the grand staircase toward the tier of private boxes rather than climbing the narrow servants' stairs to the gallery, accompanied by Alexander, whose steady presence beside her felt both protective and exposing as they passed through corridors where elegantly dressed society members turned to observe them with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Entering Alexander's private box felt like stepping into a different world from the distant vantage point she had occupied for 3 years, the stage suddenly intimate and accessible rather than remote, the rich fabrics of the box furnishings speaking of a luxury she had only glimpsed from afar, and she became acutely aware that from this prominent position she was no longer an invisible observer, but rather a spectacle herself, subject to the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes that she could feel upon her even before the performance began. Emily arrived moments later with her husband, her face alight with delight at this development, embracing Clara with a warmth that provided momentary relief from the weight of hostile attention, and shortly after Lord Philip Ashford joined them, his assessment of Clara swift but apparently favorable as he bowed over her hand with a genuine smile that suggested Alexander had chosen his confidence well. The performance that evening was The Barber of Seville, a comedy whose lightness seemed almost mockingly incongruous with the tension Clara felt radiating from the surrounding boxes. And during the first intermission, when Alexander excused himself briefly to speak with the house manager, she became aware of Lady Catherine Westbrook's deliberate approach, the older woman's expression carved into lines of aristocratic displeasure as she paused at the entrance to the box. Lady Westbrook's gaze swept over Clara with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for inferior merchandise, and when she spoke it was ostensibly to Emily, but clearly intended for Clara's hearing, remarking in a voice pitched to carry that it was remarkable how some individuals mistook a duke's charitable attention for genuine regard, and how unfortunate it would be when such misunderstandings resulted in public embarrassment for all involved. The cut was so deliberate and cruel that Clara felt the blood drain from her face, and she watched as several other society women who had been approaching the box turned away in a coordinated display of social exclusion, their fans snapping open to facilitate whispered commentary that needed no auditory confirmation to communicate its contemptuous nature. Alexander returned to find the box's atmosphere transformed, his swift glance taking in Clara's pale composure and Lady Westbrook's lingering presence. And without hesitation, he positioned himself beside Clara's chair and placed his hand deliberately over hers where it rested on the chair arm, a gesture of public claim that could not be misinterpreted by anyone observing. "Lady Westbrook," he said with a coldness Clara had never heard in his voice, "I trust you are offering your congratulations to Miss Pemberton on her kindness in accepting my attentions, as I have made clear to anyone who inquired that I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate to have secured her regard." The words were polite in form but absolute in substance, a statement that left no room for misunderstanding about the seriousness of his intentions, and Clara felt her heart steady even as she watched Lady Westbrook's expression shift from condescension to calculation as the older woman reassessed the situation before withdrawing with a tight smile that promised this confrontation was merely postponed rather than concluded. The week that followed the evening at the opera brought a cascade of consequences that Clara had anticipated, but whose intensity nevertheless threatened to overwhelm her fragile hope. As anonymous letters began arriving at their modest home, with messages so cruel in their assessment of her presumption and worthiness that she found herself hiding them from her mother, whose worry had already deepened into visible anxiety about the social storm they had unwittingly entered. Society's retaliation for Alexander's public declaration took forms both subtle and overt, from shopkeepers who suddenly remembered they had no availability when Clara inquired about services to former acquaintances who crossed streets to avoid greeting her, and the cumulative weight of this coordinated exclusion pressed upon her spirit with a force that made her question whether any connection, however genuine, could justify exposing Alexander to the disapproval and potential damage that her presence in his life seemed to guarantee. Margaret had reported that Lady Westbrook herself had called at their home during an hour when she knew Clara to be out, ostensibly to offer guidance, but actually to suggest with pointed clarity that a woman of true character would recognize when her involvement with a gentleman of superior station created more harm than benefit. And though her mother had defended Clara with fierce maternal loyalty, the visit had planted seeds of doubt that took root in soil already prepared by Clara's lifelong internalization of her own inadequacy. On the afternoon of December the 17th, Clara found herself waiting in the winter garden where Alexander had requested to meet her, the cold day matching her internal chill as she rehearsed the words she had determined to speak, the release she would offer him from any obligation he might feel toward a woman whose presence brought him nothing but social complication, and whose background could never truly complement his position, regardless of whatever temporary attraction he might have conceived. Alexander arrived with an expression that suggested he had anticipated her intentions, his jaw set with a determination she had come to recognize as indicative of his diplomatic training, where opposition strengthened rather than weakened resolve. And when she began her carefully prepared speech about how she could not in good conscience continue an acquaintance that brought him such difficulty, he interrupted with an intensity that stilled her words before they could fully form. He spoke then of his years in diplomatic service, where he had existed in a state of perpetual isolation, surrounded by people who wanted access to his title and influence, but cared nothing for the man beneath those external designations, described the profound loneliness of being constantly observed yet never truly seen, and revealed that in 3 years of attending the opera, he had noticed her precisely because her attention seemed focused not on his position, but on something more essential that she somehow perceived across the distance that separated their seats. "Clara," he said with a rawness that stripped away all formal courtly manner, "I have spent my entire adult life being valued for everything except who I actually am. And then I discovered a woman who watched me not knowing I observed her in return, whose face reflected genuine emotion in response to music we both loved, who saw me rather than my title, because from the gallery my title was invisible, and only the man remained. His hands reached for hers with a gentleness that nevertheless communicated absolute certainty, their fingers intertwining with an intimacy that transcended the formal boundaries they had previously maintained. And in that moment of connection, Clara understood that his isolation and hers, though born of vastly different circumstances, had created a shared understanding of what it meant to exist unseen, and that in recognizing each other, they had found something society's approval could neither grant nor remove. Christmas Eve arrived with a softness unusual for London in winter, snow falling in gentle curtains that muffled the city's usual cacophony and created an atmosphere of hushed expectancy that seemed to Clara entirely appropriate for the evening, that would either confirm the impossible dream her life had become or reveal it as temporary illusion destined to dissolve under the weight of reality's return. Alexander had invited her to his townhouse with a formality in the written request that suggested significance beyond their usual meetings, and as she entered his private study, she found herself in a room that spoke of the man she had come to know rather than the Duke society saw, with books lining walls in comfortable disorder and a fire burning in the hearth that cast dancing shadows across furniture chosen for comfort rather than display. He stood as she entered with an expression that held both determination and vulnerability, and she understood before he spoke that this moment carried consequences that would define the remainder of her existence, one way or another, her heart beating with such force she felt certain he must hear it across the space that separated them. "Clara," he began, and then seemed to abandon whatever careful speech he had prepared, crossing to where she stood with movements that communicated urgency, barely restrained by the manners his position demanded. And when he took both her hands in his, she felt the tremor in his fingers that revealed his composure was hard-won rather than natural. "I have spent this past month attempting to find words adequate to what I feel," he said, "but every phrase I construct seems insufficient to convey the transformations that you have created in my life simply by seeing me, when I had begun to believe I was invisible to everyone except as a girl and fortune to be pursued." He drew her toward the fire, and she went unresisting, though her mind raced with equal measures of hope and disbelief. And when he released one hand to reach into his waistcoat pocket, she felt time slow, as if the universe itself held its breath, waiting for what came next. The ring he withdrew was simple, despite the obvious value of the sapphire at its center, a stone, the deep blue of evening sky that caught the firelight and held it, and he met her eyes with an intensity that stripped away all pretense as he said, "This belonged to my mother, who wore it for 40 years of marriage to a man who valued her for herself rather than her connections, and I can imagine no more fitting symbol of what I hope to offer you if you will consent to become my wife." Clara felt tears spill over despite her attempt at composure, the words she had never allowed herself to imagine actually hearing, now resonating in the warm air between them, and when she tried to speak, her voice emerged broken by emotion as she said, "I do not understand how this is possible, how you could want someone like me when you might have anyone." Alexander set the ring aside momentarily to frame her face with both hands with a gentleness that nevertheless communicated absolute certainty, and his reply came with the patient intensity she had come to recognize as characteristic of his deepest convictions. "I want you precisely because you are you," he said, "because in 3 years of watching me, you saw not what I could provide, but who I actually am. Because your passion for beauty and music mirrors my own. Because your dignity in the face of society's cruelty reveals a strength of character I admire beyond measure. And because when I imagine my future, the only version that holds any appeal is one with you beside me." She nodded, then unable to form words, and he retrieved the ring and slid it onto her finger with hands that had steadied now that the crucial question had been asked. And when he drew her into his arms and kissed her, with a tenderness that gradually deepened into passion, she understood that the distance between the gallery and the box had been closed forever and that she was finally, truly seen. March 15th arrived with the tentative warmth of early spring, a day when London seemed to shake off winter's grip and emerge into softer light that felt to Clara like a benediction on the transformation her life had undergone in the 4 months since Alexander had slipped his mother's sapphire ring onto her finger and claimed her as his own, before society and heaven alike. The church where they had chosen to marry was neither the grandest nor the most fashionable, but rather the small parish where her father had been buried 5 years prior, a choice that had surprised those members of society who had expected the Duke to assert his status through architectural magnificence, but which had communicated to Clara that Alexander understood what mattered most was the joining of their actual lives rather than the performance of a spectacle for observers whose opinions held no weight in his considerations. She stood now in the small vestibule with her mother, whose tears had been flowing steadily since dawn, Margaret's hands trembling as she adjusted the veil that had been her own wedding veil 35 years prior, and which Clara wore as a tangible connection to the love her parents had shared, and which had given her a template for recognizing genuine devotion when Alexander offered it, despite all the evidence society provided that such recognition was implausible. Emily stood beside her, as attendant wearing a gown of soft rose that complemented the cream silk of Clara's wedding dress, a garment whose elegant simplicity had been chosen by Clara herself over the more elaborate options Alexander's wealth could easily have provided. And Emily's presence represented the friendship that had sustained Clara through years of social invisibility and had given her courage to attend that November performance when everything had changed. Through the church doors, Clara could hear the murmur of assembled guests, a gathering that included Philip, who would stand as Alexander's groomsman and whose friendship had proven as loyal as Emily's, but also members of society who had treated Clara with dismissive cruelty only months ago, and who now arrived with smiles that failed to disguise the calculations behind their changed attitudes, though Lady Westbrook had notably declined her invitation in a final gesture of disapproval that bothered Clara not at all. The music began, and Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand with fierce maternal pride before releasing her to walk down an aisle lined with late winter flowers. And as Clara moved forward, she saw Alexander waiting at the altar with an expression of such complete peace and certainty that her own nervousness dissolved into the simple joy of moving toward the man who had seen her when she believed herself invisible. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and promises exchanged, Alexander's voice steady as he pledged his life to hers, and her own voice surprisingly clear as she offered the same pledge in return, and when the clergyman pronounced them married and Alexander lifted her veil to kiss her as his wife, she heard the collective intake of breath from assembled witnesses, who understood they were observing not merely a social alliance, but a genuine love match that defied every convention their world held dear. As they walked back down the aisle together, Clara caught sight through the church's eastern window of the opera house, visible in the distance, and she thought of the girl who had sat in the gallery watching a solitary duke, and never imagining that the distance between their worlds could be crossed. And she felt gratitude for every moment of loneliness that had prepared her to recognize love when it finally found her. September arrived in 1825 with the golden light of early autumn that transformed London into something softer than its usual harsh edges, and Clara stood in the private box at the opera house that had become as familiar to her as her own drawing room over the 18 months since she had become the Duchess of Thornhill, watching the stage with an appreciation deepened by the knowledge that she need never again count coins to determine whether beauty was affordable or ration her access to the music that fed her soul as surely as bread sustained her body. Beside her sat Alexander with their infant daughter asleep against his shoulder. Little Margaret, named for Clara's mother, who had lived just long enough to hold her granddaughter and whisper her gratitude that Clara had found a love worthy of the example her parents had provided before passing peacefully in her sleep 3 months prior. The opera tonight was La Clemenza di Tito, the same production that had been playing that October evening nearly 2 years ago when Clara had climbed to the gallery seat, never imagining that the solitary duke she observed through her father's old opera glasses would notice her existence, much less pursue her with a determination that had scandalized society and transformed both their lives into something neither had dared hope possible in their separate lonelinesses. Clara's gaze drifted upward to the gallery, where a young woman sat in the 3rd row on the left side, the same seat Clara had occupied for 3 years, and she recognized in the woman's absorbed expression and carefully mended dress the circumstances that had once been her own, and she felt Alexander's hand cover hers as he noticed the direction of her attention and understood without words the emotion the sight created. After the performance, they would seek out that young woman, as had become their practice. Whenever Clara spotted someone whose situation mirrored her former state, and Alexander would quietly arrange a season subscription while Clara offered friendship without condescension, and together they would ensure that beauty remained accessible to those whom society deemed unworthy of such pleasures, a small rebellion against the cruelty they had both experienced in different ways. Lady Westbrook had left London society entirely after a scandal involving her own family had stripped away her position as arbiter of propriety, and Clara had felt not triumph at the woman's fall, but rather a sad recognition that those who wielded cruelty most enthusiastically were often those most frightened of their own vulnerability to judgment. Philip and Emily had become not merely allies, but genuine friends whose children played with little Margaret, and whose presence in their lives represented the family they had built from affection rather than obligation. And the 4 of them had created a small circle that valued substance over appearance and kindness over status. As the final notes of the opera faded and the audience began their applause, Clara looked at her husband holding their sleeping daughter and thought of the girl she had been who had believed herself invisible and unworthy of love, and she understood that the greatest transformations often begin with the simple act of being truly seen by someone who looks beyond surface to recognize the worth that was always present, waiting only for acknowledgement. If you have felt invisible in your own life, if you have believed that your circumstances define your value, or that the limitations others perceive in you represent actual truth rather than their failure of vision, know that your story is not finished, and that recognition may arrive from the most unexpected direction when you least anticipate its coming but most need its validation.